Donna. For part A, how many examples of the effects that a single story has do we have to include? Good question. Basically, we are looking for potential consequences. We didn't really give you a specific amount of consequences, but I'd say probably around 2 to 3 impacts of the single story. Remember, that one's not specific to Africa, but just generally speaking, what happens when a single story is the only thing that we have to as a depiction of the truth. So yeah, 2 or 3 would work. For direct quotes, like I have said previously, basically we won't take points off for not having direct quotes. So paraphrasing is completely fine. But seeing as how you have all the source material with you, can't hurt. Can't hurt to do direct quotes. But again, it's not necessary and it's not needed. So if it's going to distract you, if it's going to make it so that you don't do something properly, then I'd say ignore it. Alan, if I'm showing, it's a question for you, bud. If I'm showing like 20 something concurrent viewers, does that mean that those are all the people watching right now? They're just not in chat? Okay. Well, for those of you watching and not in chat, you might want to get into the chat so you can ask questions. Hi, Harper. This is more of a class experience, so if you would get into the chat, that'd be excellent. After all, this is mostly for us to do some Q&A, so it'd be nice if you guys get on. It'd be cool. There we go. Yeah, the point is that we do a live chat. So I'd much rather you have we have people in here talking. Any other questions for English since you have me here? I know a lot of us might not have started our studying process yet, which is not great, but remember that your IUE is in a week, so if you have questions, please let me know, particularly for English. For SI as well. If you want to ask questions for SI, I'm here. Hello. Hi, people. Yeah, much better. See? If you're viewing, get in the chat. So, no other questions? It's like that lull in the classroom when no one asks any questions. Hi, Chelsea. Toshi, Emily, Sophia, Vincent, Muriel. Hello. Hi. Hello. People just saying hi. Do you guys have any questions or no? Then we just move on. Here we go. Prince Lovely. I don't know who that is. But okay. Should we include information? I would. Particularly when you are doing your discussion of what a single story is. You don't have to mention Chimamanda Adichie. You don't have to mention even Africa specifically there because you're just talking about the concept of a single story. But she does talk a lot about what a single story is. I mean, she defines it. So I would definitely use the information from the TED Talk. You don't have to cite it though. Okay. Josh, no, we're good. We're basically starting. We're doing an English Q&A for the IUE if you have it. Questions. You can also do SI questions too. Emily, transitioning from AR to SI, there's a pretty natural transition there, I think. And if you really take into account how you are ending AR and what you're starting SI with, remember you're ending AR with the discussion of what took place in the obscuring of history, and then you're starting in SI section with brief context for the second wave of imperialism. So there's a very natural transition there, I think. Vincent, no. In the SI section, you will not be mentioning the early West African civilizations, because you're primarily discussing Africa's colonial history there. Okay. Toshi, no direct quotes. Don't worry about using evidence from the text in terms of like direct evidence. However, like I was saying to Alan before, it's not necessarily a bad thing to do that. So if you want to include direct quotes, go for it. Ah, lovely. Prince Lovely is Malcolm Lovelace. Okay. Sources that you have that introduce or elaborate on Africa's single story. You would remember when we did SI, we started on the first day of SI, we started talking through some of the content of Africa's single story when it comes to the different sources that we look at. When we talked about like imperialist and romanticized mindset from different media examples, as well as the news articles that you brought to class that day and we went over. In English, we also went over Africa's single story in particular, using that TED Talk, using Headstrong Historian. And so I would go back to those sources to try and figure out how you want to put together that information for Africa's single story. All right. If you're just joining us, we're doing a Q&A right now for English and for SI. So ask questions. Well, when you're talking about the single story, no, you don't have to mention Adichie. You don't have to put her name in it. You don't necessarily have to talk about her quote either. You can paraphrase it, and that'll be good. Josh, that's going to be found on Schoology. I'm going to be posting up that information after the live stream today. Okay. Toshi, in terms of the structural stuff for the IUE, first you are discussing Section A. You're talking about, generally speaking, what is single story, and then consequences of a single story. And then I would, from there, in Section B, use the discussion of Africa's single story in particular, using or talking about the imperialist mindset and romanticized mindset. I'd use that as a transition, talking about how LeBlanc presents that information and then presents a challenge to that single story using its characters and events. And then, going into AR, talking about, and SI talking about the historical ways of refuting or balancing the single story. Josh, it's not posted on my Schoology yet, so I'll make sure it gets posted right after this live stream. I was going to talk through the assignment real quick, so. As we're waiting on some more questions here, tomorrow in English, I'm planning on going through transitions specifically. But today is more specifically talking through the sections for English. So again, if you have questions about those, please feel free to ask. Gus, come here. Come here. Why are you sniffing stuff? Come here. Yeah. All right. Toshi, in terms of specific examples from LeBlanc, we are asking for only one example for each section. So in section B, where you talk about the single story and how it's presented in LeBlanc, you're talking through one character and a scene in which that character is involved and how that shows imperialist mindset. And then for section C, which is balancing the single story, same thing for choosing a character and then a scene that is going to show how that single story is challenged. Hi. Yeah. Muriel, yes, we are going to be learning about Black consciousness after a few minutes here. I'm going to leave the Q&A a little bit more, or I'm going to have the Q&A session go on a little bit longer for the people that are joining a little later, and then we'll start Black consciousness probably around 12:45 or 12:40. Let's say 12:45. so that everyone can be here for the SI if they need it. Okay. Undress. The way that it's presented on the outline is probably how I would do it. B and C could probably go together, because it's describing the lesson and then it's talking through the like what you've got out of applying that lesson to the single story that you're talking about. So I would do B and C together. Okay. The live is gonna go probably until 1. We're gonna go through the Black Consciousness stuff together with my SI class, and so likely gonna go till 1. I'll post this up on Schoology or on YouTube though, a recorded version of this live chat and the lecture for SI. Malcolm, I think it's pretty easy. Remember, you're talking about race being used as a justification and how the colonial people or how the colonists understood race. I think that might be a nice little giveaway there. Just think about that. Yeah, but okay. I'm gonna sit. Okay. Chloe, not that I can think of. Everything should basically be the same thing, except you're typing it instead of writing it. You don't need to do page numbers this time because obviously you're not stapling anything together. So yeah. Hi, Nicole. Okay, in about 8 minutes, I'll be starting the Black Consciousness notes. Basically, just going through what you could write about for your Black Consciousness section for your IUE. Harper, like before, there is no transition between intro and the first paragraph because that would be strange. It's your own example. Catherine, no, not necessarily. As always, it's pretty much just what you think, how much you think you need to write, and giving a full description. Yes, Emma. If you worked on the mural, then I'd like the physical copy. Molly, you can watch the recorded version of this. I'll put up a recorded version on YouTube for any questions that might have been asked but you missed. Alright, guys. You wanna go down? Probably, Ashley. I don't see why not. I mean, you guys worked hard on it, right? Oh, there's Miss O. So there's your response. Gus, what are you smelling, buddy? All right. Well, uh, looks like nobody has any more questions for English, and so I'll go ahead and um, start talking through the Black Consciousness notes. Hey, come here. What are you smelling, dude? Hmm? Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. I'll go ahead and start talking through the Black Consciousness notes. Or not, Sophia. Let's see. Yeah, for sure. When you're talking about the challenges to the single story or balancing out the single story and what that actually looks like and how you're doing it in your through using the different content of your essay, you should definitely be talking about the different single stories about Africa throughout the IUE. I think that's a huge part of what you're doing in the essay. So even if it's not explicitly talked about, saying like, hey, you gotta mention single story in the AR section, you gotta mention single story in the SI section, you should definitely be talking about them as you talk through how it challenges or how it connects to the thesis, which is challenging the single story. So you definitely have to talk through addressing different single stories about Africa. Yeah. Josh, that's in the reading. World Imperialism and Colonialism. You can also find it in your notes about the Scramble for Africa. All right, in 2 minutes, we're going to go ahead and start the Black Consciousness notes. come up here? Come. Yeah. It's pretty good, Nicole. Pretty good. Come here. Oh, yeah. Oh. Oh. That's a good boy. Malcolm, the stuff was due this morning, buddy. 8 o'clock. For the muralist and for the campaign. The character analysis for me is due at 11:59 p.m., okay? Whoa. Hey, buddy. Pasha, the campaign and mural stuff was due at 8 in the morning. The character analysis and the questions are due at 11:59 p.m. for me. Oh, hey, buddy. All right. Yeah, Pasha. We're going to go ahead and get started with the SI section, or the SI portion of the lecture. So we're going to talk through Black consciousness today, specifically talking through one of the resistance strategies that you guys would have learned about through the Socratic seminar, because we couldn't do that this time around. We're going to go ahead and get started looking through Black consciousness, more specifically, particularly because, you know, it's part of your IUE, but in terms of the concepts that Biko talks about, talking through undoing some of the internalized components of the system of oppression they found themselves in South Africa. We're going to be talking through how Biko attempts to combat these things. All right. So I'll go ahead and get the notes up. And what you're going to see here is basically 5 of the most important components of Black consciousness, and we're going to talk through each one of them as they come up on the screen. All right, so let me see if I can set this up right. And so what you should be seeing on your screen is lecture notes and maybe me in the corner. Right? So when we're talking about Black consciousness, the movement really comes out of a student. It's a student-led movement. Basically, the Black consciousness movement comes out after Nelson Mandela and other prominent leaders of the African National Congress, the ANC, were arrested and jailed in 1964. All right, so a lot of the prominent leaders, resistance leaders, were arrested. They were put away, and the Black South African population sort of needed another gathering movement to combat the apartheid policies that were put in place by the government. And so Biko, as a university student at Fort Hare, he would actually break with what was called the National Union of South African Students, the NUSS, which is a multiracial coalition. That means including the white South African population, student population, that were sort of fighting against the are working to undo some of the apartheid policies. And he breaks from that group and he forms what's known as the South African Students Organization, the SASO. And it is within that organization that it really starts to sort of put together the main components of what's now known as the Black Consciousness Movement. It took a lot of sort of the same ideas and beliefs of the La Negritude movement, the Black Power movement in America, but it was a nonviolent resistance movement, right? Militantly nonviolent is the way that they would put it. So it would be direct action, and they would be aggressive but not violent, right? And so the question here is why does Biko break away from a coalition or a group that includes white students? And he goes at length about this in multiple discussions, but I think it's he sort of best puts it, or he explains how and why he splits with the coalition in some of his essays that he wrote during the time. And I want to actually read out the section of some excerpts from the essay that I think are clearly outline why Biko breaks from that group. And so here we go. And I'll actually post the link to these excerpts on Schoology, so if you want to reference them at some point, you can. And here's what he has to say. So he says, "We now come to the group that has long enjoyed confidence from the black world, the white liberal establishment, including radical and leftist groups. The biggest mistake the black world ever made was to assume that whoever opposed apartheid was an ally. How many white people fighting for their version of a change in South Africa are really motivated by genuine concern and not by guilt? A white person possesses the natural passport to the exclusive pool of white privileges, yet at the back of his mind is a constant reminder that he is quite comfortable as things stand and therefore should not bother about change. I am not sneering at the liberals and their involvement, neither am I suggesting that they are the most to blame for the black man's plight. Rather, I am illustrating the fundamental fact that total identification by white liberals with an oppressed group, blacks, in a system that forces one group to enjoy privilege and to live on the sweat of another, is impossible. The liberal must fight on his own and for himself. If they are true liberals, they must realize that they themselves are oppressed, and they must fight for their own freedom and not that of the nebulous they, the blacks, with whom they can hardly claim identification." And so I'll pause there. Basically what Biko is talking about is, looking at the fact that the white liberal students benefited from the apartheid policies. They were a group that could not identify with a black South African group. They had nothing in common with them aside from the fact that maybe they wanted these apartheid policies reduced or eliminated, right? Finding some common ground. This is a lot like what Shembe is talking about in terms of the conversations that he has with Charlie. Charlie wants to build bridges. The white liberal students in the NUSAS wanted to build bridges, but not fully comprehending what that would take and not fully comprehending the wide divide between the experiences between black South Africans and white South Africans. And so Biko very sort of importantly draws the line between white and black South African, and people might be wary of this and say something like, well, if you draw the line, how are you ever going to work together? If you draw the line, how is anything going to get done? How are you going to build those bridges? Biko's argument here is that the white group needs to figure out a way to undo the internalization that they've created in their own minds about themselves being superior and benefiting from this oppressive system. They have to deal with that on their own because that experience is wholly different from the experience of a black South African. And so then he forms a South African Students Organization in order to deal with the black South African problem as a black South African group. And so, again, he's not trying to say that they don't actually care. They might, but that their fight is different. Their goal is different. And the way that they're going to achieve those things is ultimately then going to be different as well. And so that's why he breaks. And actually the Black Consciousness movement and the SASO includes Asians. It includes, it's in quotations, colored people, basically anyone who was not white, anyone who did not benefit from the apartheid policies. And so the word black here sort of encompassing anyone who was not part of the oppressor group, regardless of whether or not they identified as an oppressor. I'm going to pause here really quickly so that we can talk through if there were any questions. All right, so any questions? Donna, that's a really good question. Why is Black consciousness mainly targeted towards students? We sort of have to think about, there's no, I don't think there's actually a specific answer to this question, but if you're thinking about where a lot of social change happens, it actually starts with people who are willing to sort of go against the status quo. And when you think about college students being from the little liberal backgrounds and universities being places where liberal ideas are sort of more, Gus, come here, widely disseminated, that might be why it's targeted at students. It's undoing the damage of sorry, I lost my train of thought. Sort of undoing the hey. Undoing the damage of the establishment, the established apartheid policies. Ashley, yeah, sort of. It was done basically in meetings. It was done through gatherings. It was done through speeches, etc. All right, any other questions that you wanted to ask before I moved on? A bit upstairs. Oh, Ashley, was it accessible to everyone? Not quite. This was happening at the university level, but when you were thinking about, wait, are you talking about, like, what education are you talking about? Are you talking about just higher education in general, or are you talking about the Black consciousness movement stuff? Yeah, so if we're thinking about um, how Black consciousness was being disseminated, that was being done apart from what was happening in the college classes. That was something that Steve Biko was calling for happening on the side. So in organizing these movements, they were trying to disseminate um, um, this kind of education to the people, because that's the stuff that wasn't accessible in the first place. Right. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and move forward then, and we'll talk through. Uh, hey, we'll talk through some of the 5 components of Black consciousness. Um, so the one of the big. Sorry, give me 1 second here. One of the factors, now we talked about 5 important components. One of the really important components is the fact that Black consciousness is focused primarily on education. And so you don't have to write these quotes down, but it's something that you might want to read through. I'll read it through with you. That what Biko was ultimately trying to do was teach not just his generation of peers, but also sort of reaching out to the rest of the Black South African community, that what they had been taught about Black history, what they had been taught about their roles in South African society, all had to do with benefiting the white population. And so, remember, if you think back to those policies of apartheid, the Bantu Education Act, the one that basically prevented them from teaching about their own culture, the one that forced them into a trade curriculum rather than on a track for higher education or university level education. You think about the ways in which they're restricted. Biko was attempting to sort of undo those restrictions, right? Black consciousness was about re-educating, reawakening a self-consciousness. He talks about it being, as you see here, a reappropriation of Black self-consciousness, right? And so, like, taking what it means to be Black away from the white oppressor, and sort of then rediscovering what being Black then means, and then of course widely disseminating that. So that's one component of Black consciousness, right? This focus on education. Second focus is on psychological liberation, and it's right in the word itself, right? Liberation. What Biko is attempting to do here is undo the centuries of internalized oppression that has sort of permeated throughout the continent, and specifically in South Africa. And he's trying to undo all those beliefs about West is best, right? So the quote here being, for Black consciousness, the struggle begins with the person coming to self or coming to consciousness. And you do that by understanding your history, your culture, your humanity. Once you understand just how unjust apartheid policy is and what your role in apartheid society is, then you can sort of free yourself of this way of thinking where you are just you are actually a second-class citizen, that you should be subjugated, that you shouldn't have privilege, etc., because of the color of your skin, right? So the second component is psychological liberation, freeing yourself. That quote, I think a lot of people use it in their sarf, right? Is like the most potent weapon in the hands of an oppressor is the mind of the oppressed, right? So we talk about that, the idea that if you have something like hegemony, where you enforce particular beliefs and they become normalized over time, then we see that it's just the natural state of things, that black actually does mean second-class citizen, right? That black it actually that the color of skin does determine what kind of access you should or shouldn't have. So black consciousness was about the reawakening of consciousness, the freeing of the black mind from white constructs of what it means to live in South Africa. Third is a development of identity, and these all go hand in hand. And so if you're thinking like, well, how is this different from the previous one? If you think about it, development of identity can only really happen once you have freed yourself of the sort of constructs, once you've freed yourself of the way in which the dominant group wants you to believe that you are, right? So you have to develop that identity afterward. And so what Biko is a proponent here is not that he's trying to negate whites as people, not that he's trying to like change the status quo and put black on top of white. It means that as it stands, that black people weren't seen as human, right? So they were treated in an inhumane way. They were dehumanized. The environment they lived in was hostile, right? And so the thing that he's trying to fix here is that he's actually trying to create an identity. He's trying to he's trying to sort of put back together what it means to be black and celebrate that idea of blackness, right? And so those first three really do go hand in hand, in the sense that you educate in order to psychologically liberate, and once psychological liberation happens, you can start developing that identity, right? I actually want to read through a section of Biko's writings that really goes into detail about these three factors before moving on to the last two. Okay, and then after I finish reading this, I'll ask questions, or if you want to have any questions, you can put it in the chat, and then we'll talk through them. And so this is from Black Consciousness and the Quest for a True Humanity, written in 1973. Here we go. A long look should also be taken at the educational system for blacks. The same tense situation was found as long ago as the arrival of the missionaries. Children were taught, under the pretext of hygiene, good manners, and other such vague concepts, to despise their mode of upbringing at home and to question the values and customs of their society. Think back to Adichie, right? The result was the expected one. Children and parents saw life differently, and the former lost respect for the latter. Now, in African society, it is a cardinal sin for a child to lose respect for his parent, yet how can one prevent the loss of respect between child and parent when the child is taught by his know-all-white tutors to disregard his family teachings? Who can resist losing respect for his tradition when in school his whole cultural background is summed up in one word: barbarism? Thus, we can immediately see the logic of placing the missionaries in the forefront of the colonization process. A man who succeeds in making a group of people accept a foreign concept in which he is expert makes them perpetual students, whose progress in the particular field can only be evaluated by him. The student must constantly turn to him for guidance and promotion. In being forced to accept the Anglo-Boer culture, the blacks have allowed themselves to be at the mercy of the white man and to have him as their eternal supervisor. Only he can tell us how good our performance is, and instinctively each of us is at pains to please this powerful, all-knowing master. This is what Black consciousness seeks to eradicate. And so, what Biko is talking through there is educating people, right? Educating Black South African community to free themselves of this notion that they are there to serve, free themselves of this notion that their home culture is can be equated down to one word, barbarism, right? That it is not that. It is not what these oppressors have been teaching us and telling us it is. In fact, it's something to be celebrated, and it's something that is beautiful. And so I want to go ahead and leave time for some questions here. So if you have questions, go ahead and start typing them into chat. Okay. Oh, shoot. Did I not have... Sorry, guys. I didn't have the thing up this whole time. The notes. Ashley, good question. It's not. Black consciousness was not aimed at changing the minds of the white oppressor. This is the reason why Steve Biko removed himself from that organization I talked about earlier, the multiracial coalition, right? Because he doesn't think that the problems are the same, right? It gives the Black community, the Black South African community, the tools to resist, right? To go against what they've been taught for their lives. Yeah. So it's not about it's not about changing the minds of the oppressor. It's changing the mind of the oppressed. Okay. Kate, I couldn't have put it better myself. It's a great way to put it. Yes. Students, let me go through the slides because I apparently did not put them up before. So you know what I'll do is this. I'll put the slides up on Schoology as well, so you can have that as a reference for yourself, just because I don't want to just leave it up and then have nothing going on in the background. Okay, so the last two components of Black consciousness are about once psychological liberation has happened, once development of identity has started, you can start focusing on the power that an individual and a group can have to make changes, to create change in that society. And so what Steve Biko is talking about here is this notion of agency, right? The ability to act, the ability to do something, right? And so what he ultimately wants to focus on is the fact that what it comes down to when you create change is not trying to change the system in its entirety at any given or at one time. What you have to really focus on is the subjectivity of the oppressed person. You can't change anything until you change the individual's way of thinking about themselves, not in relation to the white oppressor or the dominant group, because this can be the case for any oppressive system. It's looking at change within the oppressed person, and so you're looking at creating again freeing yourself, educating yourself, undoing the internalization. That's what Biko is really primarily focused on, not really I mean, he obviously talks about ways that they're going to change the economic system and ways to include or to govern, but primarily the focus has to be, particularly within a place or within an oppressive system as bad as apartheid was, that you have to change the minds of those who are oppressed in order to create any sort of meaningful change in the system. And this sort of goes back to what Peter talks about, right, in Le Blanc. He talks about the fact that, so let's say Kumalo does get in charge, we'd only be trading our white oppressors for black ones, right? The idea being that until, internally speaking, black is no longer seen as a stigma, black is no longer seen as a bad thing, ultimately, we're just going to take on their rules, there being the oppressor group, the dominant group's rules and their way of seeing things, and it'll just be the same thing, right? Until those ideas are actually dealt with and challenged and changed, until the oppressed person is able to think about themselves as equal to, then nothing really changes, right? And lastly, and perhaps in a way that we see a lot of connections with Le Blanc, right? Biko looks at race as primarily a socio-political construct. So talking through the fact that black is not about color of skin. Black is a label that is used as justification for one group to oppress another group, right? That label can be anything, but in this particular case, it being the color of your skin, right? Black people in the black consciousness philosophy were defined as those who are by law or tradition, in this case law, right, discriminated against, politically oppressed, economically exploited, and socially degraded. And so when we talked earlier about the SASO being a coalition of Asian, colored, and black students, what Biko is getting at is that these are the people who are oppressed in our society, and they are identified as black. And so what black consciousness ultimately becomes is this reawakening or reimagining of this notion of race not being a biological construct, right, but as just merely a tools to justify one's control over another. Okay, and I want to read again another excerpt here that will tie nicely into these last two factors. And here it is. Our preparedness to take upon ourselves the cudgels of struggle will see us through. We must remove from our vocabulary completely the concept of fear. Truth must ultimately triumph over evil, and the white man has always nourished his greed on this basic fear that shows itself in the black community. Special branch agents will not turn the lie into truth, and one must ignore them. In a true bid for change, we have to take off our coats, be prepared to lose our comfort and security, our jobs and positions of prestige, and our families. For just as it is true that leadership and security are basically incompatible, a struggle without casualties is no struggle. There should be a lot of Frederick Douglass quote sort of parallels there. We must realize that prophetic cry of black students, black man, you are on your own. Some will charge that we are racist, but these people are using exactly the values we reject. We do not have the power to subjugate anyone. We are merely responding to provocation in the most realistic way possible. Racism does not only imply exclusion of one race by another, it always presupposes that exclusion is for the purposes of subjugation. Blacks have had enough experience as objects of racism, not to wish to turn the tables. While it may be relevant now to talk about black in relation to white, we must not make this our preoccupation, for it can be a negative exercise. As we proceed further down or towards the achievement of our goals, let us talk more about ourselves and our struggle and less about whites. Again, agency of the black population. We have set out on a quest for true humanity, and somewhere on the distant horizon we can see the glittering prize. Let us march forth with courage and determination, drawing strength from our common plight and our brotherhood. In time, we shall be in a position to bestow upon South Africa the greatest gift possible, a more human face. And so, in looking through the 5 components of black consciousness, really, these are things that work hand in hand. These are things that go together. these are not things that, or these are things that sort of build upon each other and all sort of combine to create what is known as the Black consciousness philosophy. And in teaching about this philosophy, what Biko was ultimately trying to do was undo a lot of the internalized oppression that he found present in South African society, particularly in the Black population. Again, not necessarily focusing in on what the white oppressor could do to change things, but instead focusing primarily on what the Black population could and must do in order to reimagine, in order to redefine what it means to be Black, and therefore to become fully human, because that was something that was missing up to that point. All right, let's go ahead and talk through questions now. Donna, yeah, pretty much. It's about redefining what it meant to be Black, because their history for so long had been taught in such a way that it was seen as barbaric and primitive by the European colonizer. Right? Barbarism is like the description of something as primitive, as savage, without notions of civilization, etc. Kate, maybe I'm misunderstanding the question. What do you mean by that? Oh, I see. Okay. So what he's getting at here is when he says things that make them not more human, but actually human. So up to this point, when again they've got this internalized belief that because of the color of their skin or because of their background that they are less than. That's what they've been taught, right, in their school system, and in the ways that the society has been constructed and the laws have been formed. So what he's trying to get at there is undoing that they deserve this because they are Black. That Black means barbaric. He's trying to undo that sort of association there. That's what he's getting at. Ashley, yeah, to some extent, that's exactly what he's talking about, educating them on history and sort of redefining that history because the history was taught. There's this like the Europeans would teach about particular black leaders who rebelled against their British colonizer and failed, and they were actually like examples of how Africans were savage, etc., etc. But actually looking at that event and sort of redefining that event as them trying to take back their homeland is a reframing of education. Does that make sense? So there's accomplishments there, that there is a humanity there that was not talked about by the oppressor. And then of course, yes, that race is not something that makes the black South African inferior. It is the things that are attached to race, the associations made with race, that make them inferior in this setting, in this oppressive system, right? That's the socio-political construct part. Um, Molly, when we're talking about redefining what it means to be black and how it empowers the people, we talked earlier about how what it meant to be black in South Africa means that you are a second-class citizen, right? Black was associated with savagery. Black was associated with inferior intellect. Black was associated with different trade professions, right? You couldn't get access to higher education. That's what it meant to be black, right? And so black consciousness is about redefining that term. It's about taking back blackness, right? And instead of letting the oppressor define what that is, it's about defining it now for yourself through understanding your history, through understanding that what you live in right now is an oppressive system that is done to you by an oppressor, not because it is a natural state of things. And in terms of later on ending colonial oppression for good, there are arguments to be made that oppression still exists there. Right, South Africa, it's not like all the problems are gone suddenly. These are deep-rooted, systemic, institutional problems that continue to persist today. If you look at the wealth gap, if you look at the wealth gaps, and if you look at the wealth inequality between white South Africans and black South Africans, still those inequalities still exist. That has to do with a lot of different things. Some political failures, economic failures, but again, they stem from something that is colonial. They stem from colonial legacy, and so you have to sort of think about. We have to think about the impacts of those things and how it affects present day society. Ashley, you don't have to hey, you don't have to compare the method to other leaders. You're just explaining black consciousness in the SI section for the IUE. Okay. Any more questions? Yeah, Molly. Yes. Redefining what it means to be black absolutely means taking back the way in which the culture is taught. So again, they taught about black history. It was just that the narrative that was told was one in which they were the bad guys, right? The ones trying to undo the progress of modernization and colonialism. All right. If there are no other questions for SI, then I'm going to go ahead and conclude the stream. Those of you that are in SI currently, please make sure that you check Schoology for the homework. I'll be uploading the documents and the assignment up on Schoology today, and that will have the due date is Wednesday, so you have a couple of days, a couple of nights to complete that assignment and the reading, and so that'll be done over Schoology. So please make sure you double check Schoology today and every day. Tomorrow, I'm hoping to stream at around 10 o'clock, 10 a.m. And so if you want to tune in, I'll have more. I'll have another Q&A session for English. If you want to email me or send a message over Schoology, you can totally do that. I'll be responding to messages and emails until 3 o'clock today, so please make sure that you communicate whatever need you have. All right. Thanks for joining. Bye-bye.